The crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth is one of the best attested historical facts of the ancient world, which is not even to say anything about his religious following or his resurrection. It's just it's just something that is so well cited in the ancient world that there are virtually no scholars who would deny it. It's just not a reasonable historical position to take.
Hey, I'm Guy Powell, and welcome to the next episode of the backstory on the Shroud of Turin. And if you haven't already done so, please visit guypowell.com and sign up for more of these episodes. I am the author of the book The Only Witness, which is a Christian historical fiction tracing a possible history of the Shroud over the last 2 millennia. Today, I'm speaking with Duran Smith, and Duran is the founder of veramyth.com, which is a multimedia Christian apologetics ministry. And he is a chapter director as well, a chapter director and supported missionary in Atlanta with Ratio Christi, which is a college campus apologetics evangelism ministry. Duran, welcome, and so good to have you. You're going to have to tell us about your background and then the Ratio Christi and Veramyth and everything. So, how did you get involved in the Shroud?
Before we continue, I want to briefly tell you about my new book, The Only Witness. It's a work of Christian historical fiction rooted in years of serious research into the Shroud of Turin. The story traces what may have happened to the Shroud across 2,000 years of history through war, secrecy, faith, and survival. It puts you right into the story. If you're interested in the historical mystery behind the Shroud and its possible journey over the last 2 millennia, you can learn more and order your copy at guypowell.com or on Amazon. Now let's get back to the podcast.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me here. I'm really excited to be talking to you today. Um, my first exposure to the Shroud was really, I was that weird kid in middle school who checked out all of the weird books about paranormal stuff from the school library. And sometimes in these paranormal books about Bigfoot and UFOs and the Loch Ness Monster, you'd have these other mysteries in there like the Shroud of Turin. So that was actually the first time that I ever heard of it, and I read a lot about it back then. But moving into my later high school years and early college years, I started getting into apologetics, which is something that my dad led me into. And we sort of mutually rediscovered the Shroud of Turin at the same time because we were both digging into the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, and of course, stumbled upon the Shroud and realized there was a whole lot more to say about it than we had ever heard, for sure. So he ended up giving a presentation to his Ratio Christi chapter at the University of West Georgia, and I also gave one as a student at the university at Georgia State University. So that was when we hit the ground running, and ever since then, I've expanded on that presentation so much that it's practically become a thesis. And as you know, there is so much to Shroud research. It's so interdisciplinary that it's really fascinating for me as someone who really loves philosophy. It really does take that philosophical analysis to implement all of those disciplines together. So the Shroud of Turin is just this big cumulative case for something that's just absolutely extraordinary, and I've been completely hooked on it ever since.
Yeah, absolutely. It was same here, and I got my brother sent me a book. I mean, I had heard about it. I had heard. I'm old enough to have been around when STIRP took place and things like that, and then the radiocarbon testing in 1988, which we're going to talk a little bit more about, of course. And but one thing though you mentioned, which is kind of fascinating, and this will be a challenge to you because I've been putting a paper together and well, not a paper, a presentation together, and that is what evidences are there for the resurrection, excluding the references in the Bible?
Oh yeah. Well, there's
And
plenty of extra biblical evidence. In fact, there's a good bit of it, and it gives a lot of great insight into what the Christians in the first century truly believed, and also how the Romans didn't like them very much for what they believed. So,
yeah,
yeah, there's a
yeah.
lot of good evidence in that line.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's funny because you have to be, well, so in an ideal world, if you wanted to provide evidence of the resurrection, you would want to find non-Christians. So, like Josephus is one that would be a Jew who wrote about Christus, that he existed. And then there's kind of like a logic, you have to go through. Well, first of all, the resurrection couldn't happen unless Jesus first existed. So he had to have been, he had to have been there. And then, of course, he had to die because if he didn't die, then he couldn't have the resurrection. And then, so you have to go through all of the steps and everything. And it's anyway, it's a fascinating topic. I'd love to take you up on talking to you about that in more detail at some point.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth is one of the best attested historical facts of the ancient world, which is not even to say anything about his religious following or his resurrection. It's just it's just something that is so well cited in the ancient world that there are virtually no scholars who would deny it. It's just not a reasonable historical position to take.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, fantastic. Well, today though, we're not going to talk about that, although I'd love to. We'll hold for our next round. Today, we're going to talk about some of the typical questions that people would ask or promote in to authenticists like Duran and myself that says they're trying to say, well, the shroud was painted, or the shroud was this, or the shroud was that, and therefore it's not authentic. So let's start with the first one. The first one I have here is the shroud image is painted and is not miraculously imprinted. So what do you say about that?
Well, I think that Stirp pretty well settled this in 1978. I mean, that was the main thing they were looking for. They brought in a team, and the theory was we're just going to scrape the paint off of this thing and call it a day. And that was the very first thing that they found, was that the image on the shroud is not made of paint. It's not made of pigments. It's not made of any kind of artistic substance that an artist might have used. It is literally just a chemical change in the surface of the fibrils of the top part of the shroud, and that's what it is. There is no paint on it. Although we do have to qualify that statement just a little bit, because there have been found. I believe it was Walter McCrone who found the red ochre pigments on the shroud, but it appears that these were not used to create the shroud. They were probably leftover traces of where people had tried to create duplications of the shroud by putting some other cloth over it and trying to like trace it with a painting of some sort. Or maybe perhaps somebody at some point tried to reinforce some of the blood stains or something like that. But besides those very tiny traces of red ochre pigments, the image itself is not made of paint or an artistic substance, and the blood itself has tested to be actual human blood. So, uh, like I said, I think Stirp pretty well settled that, and I'm amazed that people still try to make that suggestion.
Well, and unfortunately, it is McCrone that kind of muddied the waters. But I guess it's also those people that made painted copies. So there are, I believe, there's evidence for about 50 painted copies of the shroud from the Middle Ages, and those painted copies then would have been painted with paint. So those painted copies then would have paint. And if you're making a copy, so if the Duke of Savoy was providing a copy, let's say to Maria Theresa in Austria, then he would to in order to increase the value of the copy, they would take the painted copy and then they would place it on top of the shroud, lay it on top of the shroud, and now it becomes what's called a secondary relic. And so now, as a secondary relic, he gives this incredibly valuable thing over to Maria Theresa or whoever it was. and now they have then a copy of what is the shroud, and now it's a painted copy. And so it's kind of interesting, how that happened. And so then when that shroud is on top of the original, when the shroud copy is on the original shroud, then it's very possible that some of the paint may have flaked off or something like that.
Yeah. And I also think, too, by the way, that a lot of the relics that we refer to as the Veil of Veronica, because the Catholic Church has several of them, I think that those are very likely traces or attempted recreations of the man on the shroud as well. And
Yeah.
those are definitely made of paint.
Well, that's and it's funny because I've been studying a couple of those, and on the Veil of Veronica, it kind of appeared in about the 1200s, so there's not really a good provenance prior to the 1200s. Well, okay, people say the same thing about the shroud. The Vale of Manipello, also has some really funky characteristics to it. You have
Mhm.
then, other things that that may have appeared. You've got the image of Genoa, where the Genoans say, "No, this is the original," and then they have there's one in San Silvestri where it says, "No, no, no, this one is original," and yet there's paint on those. And it may be the way that those cloths are put together and images are put together is that there was a cloth, maybe original, maybe a copy, and they painted over it, so that they could bring out the image. So it's fascinating to see, especially in the 12th century, I guess at the end of the Renaissance or so, where these relics then were kind of embellished or brought to life or something like that, or created
Yeah.
out of whole cloth, pun
It's just
intended.
a it's just an awfully strange thing to do to a sacred, miraculous image, is to paint over it. The the image that they refer to as the Lady of Guadalupe as well has the same problem where it's been painted over, so it's very difficult to
Mm,
determine if there's actually anything there. But the shroud doesn't have that problem because it doesn't have any kind of artistic overlay to it at all.
right, right. And then there's a handful of interesting things that if you were going to paint the image, then normally when you paint an image of a body, you draw the outline, of the face, and then you draw the outline of the body. You draw a square or a rectangle or a triangle or an oval, and then you start to use that, and then you start to paint over it in order to have it come out as being a painted image. Well, on
Yeah,
the shroud, there is no underlying outline that was ever done. So
it's true.
that's one kind of an evidence that says the image was not painted. The second thing is that there's also no, and I hope you don't mind me going on and jump in, but there's
Go
also
on.
no edge to the painting. So if
Yeah,
it were a painting, I'm sorry, no edge to the image. If it were a painting, there's an edge where the brush ends of that one color, and then there's another color or no color, and there is no edge on the shroud. And so, that's another thing. And to your point, Barry, and I don't know if you ever got to talk to Barry Schwartz at all, but
I get
he
that.
was the documenting photographer of the Stirp, the original Stirp in 1978. And so when he went over there, he says, "Wow, I'm getting a free trip to Italy. We're going to
Yeah,
find paint on this cloth, and we're going to have a fun week in Italy while after we've found the paint. I wouldn't have to do anything." And then they get over there, of course, and they spend their 120 hours in the presence, in the room, touching with
yeah,
gloves on, but touching, the shroud. And they could not find, as you were saying, they could not find evidence of paint at all on there.
yeah. It's really extraordinary. I wish I could
Yeah.
have got to see Barry. I haven't met anybody from the Stirp team, but they're still out there.
Yeah, and
But
they're getting, unfortunately, there's fewer and fewer. So there were, I guess, 33, as I recall, and
yeah,
and I think there's only 11 more with us in this world. But yeah, it is fun to get to know them, and we were just out at a conference, the Seed conference, and got to meet a couple other ones. One of the other things too on the paint, which is kind of fascinating, and sorry I keep going on here, but
you're
is
good.
that if it were painted And when you paint cloth and then you fold the cloth, the paint, the dried paint chips off or cracks. And there is no
Yeah.
evidence of that at all on the shroud.
No.
There are no cracks or anything like that on the shroud.
No. There's no bleed through. There's no the image doesn't bleed through to the other side. There's also a complete lack of directionality to the image. There's no brush strokes. There's nothing about it that would indicate that it was the sort of a progressive forming image, whereas what we see as it is something that appears to have happened all at once. And the superficiality of the image as well, the fact that it's only on the very topmost fibrils of the topmost fibers. I forget what the exact measurement is, but it's like nanometers thin, and that superficiality is consistent across the entire image, both the frontal image and the dorsal image. And for an artist to do that, even intentionally, would just be unthinkable. It would have to be so carefully crafted that you would practically have to imagine him trying to create it thread by thread, and it just doesn't make sense, you know.
Right, absolutely. And not to mention the fact that when you get close to the image, when you get close to the shroud, the image goes away, so to speak, in your eyes. The image is obviously still there, but your eyes can't see it anymore. They just kind of sees a blur.
Yeah.
And so,
This
which is very different from a painting. If you look at a painting or a photograph, the image is there whether you're 6 inches away from it or whether you're 6 feet away from it.
right.
And
This is
and
one of
so
my favorite. This is one of my favorite details about the shroud, because it's the pointillistic nature of the image, which is that the darker portions of the image are not actually the result of the image itself being darker, but of more image fibrils being closer to each other. So it's like a pointillistic work of art, except that it's not a work of art. um,
exactly.
I used to,
So
me and my dad, we used to go to this art festival every year in south of Atlanta, and there were all different kinds of artists there, and there were a couple of guys who did these kinds of pointillistic drawings with just dots, and some of them were really extraordinary. And you could get up close to them and see that it was just all these individual dots making up the darker portion, but the dots themselves were not different shades. And so when it occurred to me, when I finally read, that the shroud shading, the image shading works in exactly the same way, I was just all the more amazed. I felt like I had been prepared to understand what that meant because of those art festivals years ago.
mhm.
So it's just really, really amazing stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And then the question then is, when was pointillism invented? I only
Right.
remember the first pointillistic painting was done like in the 1800s,
Yeah.
as part of the Impressionist period. And I can't remember the artist. Was it Surratt? Maybe that did it. I don't know. Somebody probably knows better than I do. But that the invention of that, and then actually now a similar technology is how you do images, gray and white, or images on a newspaper using only black ink. Now there
Yeah.
you're doing it based on the size of the little dots. The bigger they are, then the blacker it is. The smaller they are, then the lighter they are. But that's not exactly what you're talking about. Maybe talk about how the like you were saying, how the image fibrils on the threads are similar but different to like how a newspaper is printed.
Yeah, I mean it's a similar. I mean, it's called a halftone effect. This is what it's called, and it's similar, but it's just not the same thing. First of all, because a newspaper is created with ink being put on paper, and again, the shroud image is not the result of a substance being applied to the cloth. Um, but the effect is very similar, except that, like you said, on newspaper, all the little points are slightly different. But on the shroud, as far as we can tell, and you can browse through various different micro photographs of the shroud image fibrils from different portions of the image, and you can see with your own eyes that the image fibrils themselves all have the same degree of superficiality, like I said, and that they are all roughly the same shade. It's their proximity to each other that actually creates the lightness or darkness of the image. And that lightness or darkness seems to correspond primarily with the distance from the body to the cloth. It doesn't actually correspond with contact to the cloth, but only distance from the body to the cloth, which means there are parts of the image that were not in contact with the body, which means that the image was projected through empty space from the body onto the cloth. And I know it sounds like a fantasy story, but I'm not making this up. These are the findings of Stirp.
Yeah, and it's just amazing that they had so much time to spend with it back in 1978, and then we didn't even talk about the 3D qualities. Tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the 3D quality of it is really cool. The shading of the image is so accurate and so precise in its dimensions in accordance with the Both to Claude ratio. The what did I say? The cloth to
Yeah,
body
the
ratio.
boss to clock.
Yeah,
Yeah, I got that. I got to get that URL. Let me write
there you
that
go.
one
There
down.
you go. But the shading of the image is so exact in accordance with the cloth to body ratio that it creates three-dimensional data within the cloth itself, that when you scan it through a very particular computer process, you can create a 3D model of the man on the shroud, especially by combining the frontal image and the dorsal image together. And it's entirely consistent. I mean, except for just anomalies in like damage to the cloth or scratches or other sorts of stains, which do create anomalies in the 3D model. The image itself doesn't have any of those anomalies in it. And it's entirely consistent. Like the front and the back match up together perfectly. And yeah, you get a perfect three-dimensional model of the man. And some artists have done some really incredible work with that, not just digitally recreating the man from the shroud, but also like creating 3D prints of the man. And this has resulted in some pretty extraordinary displays that are. There's one in particular, and I forget what it's called, but it's sort of touring the world at the moment.
Yeah, that's the one that was from Spain, starts with
Yes.
an S. Yeah, that one is just incredible. It has hair on it. It has all of the scourge marks, and
Yes.
it is incredibly good.
And it's incredibly sobering to look at. I mean, even just the picture, because I haven't seen it in person, but even to just look at the pictures, you
Yeah,
really see the state of the man when he was wrapped in the shroud. And then, of course, another thing that's been happening just in the last year or two is this new AI technology now. What I have found really extraordinary, because I've seen a lot at this point online, I've seen a ton of AI replications of the man on the shroud. And what's really extraordinary about that is that multiple people are doing this independent of each other, and they're coming out with almost exact results, almost the exact same results as each other. And it's just really extraordinary.
yeah, it
Um,
sure is. It really is. And those images just they if they're being made with relatively little human intervention, which I think is important, then
yeah,
it's algorithmic as to how it's interpreting the shroud image, which means that it's probably pretty close to what Jesus would have actually looked like. And that's
yeah,
what just is just jaw-dropping as to how interesting that is.
yeah. I want to address those AI artists though, because I don't know how to do that yet. But some of those AI artists, I think one thing some of them need to know that 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 I don't think some of them know is that shroud researchers have determined that there are wounds to the face. So in other words, there is facial swelling in the cheeks. And sometimes these digital recreations don't account for stuff like that. So the man ends up having these really high cheekbones that don't really make a whole lot of sense. So you do actually have to make some kind of manual adjustments to the data from the shroud if you're trying to create an image of the man as he was in life, not lying inside of the shroud. You have to reduce the swelling on the face. You have to account for, the bits missing from the beard. And
The broken nose.
there may be damage to the bridge of the nose as well. So those are just things that I think they need to look closer at and take into account. And I think we're going to get much, much better images as a result of
Well,
that.
and you bring that up, so the algorithmically, you're getting, potentially an image that's of the dead Jesus, right
Yeah.
during the moment of resurrection. He's in the tomb, and that's then, the way his body was after the crucifixion, after the beating and the scourging and everything else that happened to him. And then I think what your point is then the human side comes in, the human interpretation comes in, where you want to remove some of those marks and bruises and swellings that took place, and maybe the break in the nose and stuff like that, and so that you can get more of what a living Christ might have looked like.
Yeah. And it's already extraordinary what they've done, but there is a part of me though that wonders how far should we take this. I am not against iconography, but I am against the idea because I know that somebody somewhere is eventually going to try this. They're going to create an AI 3D model of Jesus and then input scripture into, this thing, and now we're talking to a fake animated Jesus. Like Chat GPT, and I'm really scared of that kind of reality. Maybe by talking about it now, I've manifested it. I don't know, but like,
Yeah.
maybe nobody had that idea before me. But like, that idea kind of scares me because then you're going to have AI pretending to be Jesus, and that's not going to be a good thing. So people should definitely beware of that sort of
Yeah.
thing.
Well, it's interesting. I don't know how I feel about that, but it reminds me though of going to Disney World and seeing, Abraham Lincoln standing up in that,
Yeah,
whatever that was, the Hall of Presidents, and now you have Jesus standing up and ready to answer questions. I
right,
mean, for
exactly.
me, it's a tough one. If I can bring more people to Christ that way, then is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know.
Yeah, yeah,
So I mean, to your point, you want to be truthful and true to the Bible and true to the evidence that we have. But on the other hand, if it's done in the right way, then and you're bringing people to Christ, is that a good thing or a bad thing? So
yeah. Well, people just need to understand that in terms of understanding who Jesus was and what he taught and what he said, scripture is our ultimate foundation. It's not even the shroud. The shroud is the picture.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But scripture is the story and the sermons and the meaning and everything. So we have to just put our dependence on scripture when we're coming to personally know Christ ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well let's embellish the story here a little bit. So we've been talking
Yeah.
about the whether the shroud image was painted, and I think we've debunked that. But now in the 14th century, well, a couple of things happened. So first of all, we have the radiocarbon dating, which says that the shroud was created. The linen in the shroud was created at somewhere between 1260 and 1390, so the 14th century, and it just so happens to overlap with the first appearance of the shroud in Lille, France, in the 1350s. And so then we have a lot of the non-authenticists. They reference this guy Bishop Darcis, He was a French bishop from the town of Troyes, if I remember correctly, and well, actually, if I'm pronouncing my French correctly, he was from was it Troyes or was it Besançon? I can't remember where the cathedral was. Anyway, he was losing money to Lirey because the pilgrims were going to Lirey to see the shroud, as opposed to coming to his cathedral to see his cathedral. And so then tell us about what he did, and then go from there.
Yeah, and there's a little more to that story too, which is that, I mean, he was alive at the same time as Jean de Vergy, who was, had the shroud on display, and yes, there was this sort of political, ecclesiastical drama going on about drawing, congregations to their particular church or getting that kind of attention, whatever it was. So there was some interpersonal drama going on there. But interestingly, Bishop D'Arcy's, he waited until Jean de Vergy had passed away to actually make a move against the shroud, because at that point the ownership of the shroud and the display of the shroud came under question. And at that point, of course, he wrote a letter, or intended to write a letter, to the Pope, uh, and he explained in that letter that the shroud was actually a painting, that it had been uh, cunningly painted by an artist, and that therefore it was not the real burial shroud of Jesus, and therefore it should be taken off display. People shouldn't see it anymore. And so obviously this led to some question about, the actual origins of the shroud. And to this day, we're not entirely sure where Geoffrey de Charny and Jean de Vergy actually got the shroud anyway. There are varying theories about that. Uh, maybe we could talk about that. But yeah, so this letter from that time claims that the shroud is a forgery. But I think there are two huge problems with that letter. The first one is that it claims that the shroud is a painting, not even, which is not scientifically plausible, as we've already talked about. It's been pretty well demonstrated that the shroud is not a painting. And the other weird thing, too, about this letter that I think really lowers its credibility is that he doesn't name the artist. He doesn't say who the artist was, or exactly how they made it, or what their intention was for it, or why the de Charnys had it and not the artist. He doesn't say anything about that. He also seems to imply that the artist had confessed to it. But if the artist was still alive, again, why did the other people have it? So there are a lot of holes in this story, and it just brings up a whole lot of other questions that there don't seem to be clear answers for. And because of the interpersonal drama that was going on between these churches in this region, and because of disagreements about, whether the shroud should be on display at all, it seems most likely, unfortunately, that this bishop was just lying to try to gain some leverage. And the fact that he waited until Jean de Vergy had died to start doing this just goes to show that it was calculated. So those are the reasons why I find no reason to take that letter seriously. But would you add anything to that?
Yeah, there's a couple of things, and it is a fascinating story, and it just shows, the politics and the economics and all kinds of things that were going on all the time. I mean, men are men, and man is man, and the lucre
Yeah,
is important, and what have you, and certainly even this bishop who was supposedly above board, and made it to the rank of bishop. He should have tried to have been a little bit more circumspect. But what's interesting is, so at that Sikh conference that I mentioned, which took place last July, there was a presentation by a Finnish guy and they've done a lot of studying on that writing, and I'll use the word writing for the moment. And because apparently you can actually go into the French archives and find that letter or that writing, and you can view it now, and you can view the original of it. And so, what's interesting though is that two things: in order for it to be real and to be something that is of substance, it has to be dated and it has to be signed. And the original copy that's in the French archives is neither. It has no date, and it is not, and it's not signed. So therefore, most likely, this writing is not a letter. It was written but never sent because it didn't have a date and it wasn't signed. Now, what's interesting to me though is okay. So you have a bishop. He writes this text, and he doesn't send it, but somehow it ends up in the French archives. Now, number one. Number two is that if you were going to write a letter, you would always make two copies. You'd have one for yourself, and you'd have one for the recipient. So in this case, it would have been the Pope. And now, during this time in the 1350s or so, this was the time of the anti-pope. So in the 1350s, there was the one pope was in Avignon in France, and the other pope was in Rome in Italy. And so, what's not clear to me is, if he had sent it, would he have sent it to the Roman pope in Rome, or would he have sent it to the French pope in Avignon? And then, secondly, then how did this text, if it was never sent, why is it in the French archives? If it's not important, why wasn't it just thrown away? So, where did that come from? And that's one thing. And one last point is, in response to this writing, the Pope writes and gives a more or less an edict to the church in Lire, which says you can display the shroud, but you can't say that it's authentic.
Right.
And then the other thing is that he writes something to Bishop Darcis and says, "Shut up. Stop talking about this.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'm going to defrock you," or whatever the term is.
Right.
So
Yeah.
anyway, those are a couple of additions there. I don't know. Let me, I'm sure you have some further stuff as well.
No, that's pretty much all I have on that. It was the end of the matter. There was no other correspondence about it, so there's nothing for us to go on. In terms of are you implying that that the letter itself is perhaps a forgery, or um, what
No,
is the implication there?
no, and his name is Timu Harkonnen, and he's with the Finnish Shroud organization, and he's the one that presented at the Sikh conference. And what he said is that it's probably real. The letter itself is authentic from the
Okay.
1300s, but because it wasn't dated and because it wasn't signed, it was never sent. And so then, which
Oh,
is kind of interesting. If it was never sent, then how did the Pope find out about it to respond to it? So there must
right.
have been a whole bunch of other machinations going on that would have, caused the Pope to nevertheless send a message to both the Lire Church and the Bishop Darcis and Besançon, I think in Troyes or Besançon, to respond.
Yeah. Yeah. Skeptics like to bring up this objection all the time because it's one of the things that sometimes comes up if you just Google the shroud. If you Google the shroud, you're going to find two things immediately. You're going to find the carbon dating, and you're going to find this medieval letter that says that the shroud was a forgery from that time period, from the late 1300s. And it's just really frustrating because the skeptics haven't bothered to. I mean, a lot of blog articles, for example, don't bother to really dig into the details of these things. But and the carbon dating thing is complicated for sure, but the medieval letter is really not that complicated. There's no reason to really lend any credibility to this claim that it was created by an artist.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I like that argument. I haven't heard that one before, so I'm filing that one away, hopefully in my brain cells, and it'll stay there. But that's a good one. I hadn't heard that one before.
Yeah.
I'm gonna skip over the radiocarbon dating. I know we touched on
Sure.
it. It said it was 1260 to 1390, but everybody talks about that, and after a while, it just gets to be a little
Yeah.
bit weird. Now, one of the other objections to the shroud being authentic is the mention of the cloths in the Gospels, in the Passion stories. And so, tell us about the Passion stories and what happens there, and then why or how potentially the shroud either fits or doesn't fit, and has been used now as an objection to the authenticity.
Yeah, this is an objection that a lot of Christians bring up because they read their Bibles like good Christians, and that's good. um, yeah, when most Christians read their Bible, they end up coming away with a picture of Jesus's burial as if he was buried kind of like a mummy. And I don't know if that's I don't know where a lot of people are getting that idea. Maybe just from too many movies, which I'm also guilty of. But I mean, there is a bit in the Gospel of John, chapter 20, that does say that, or rather, I'm sorry, in John chapter 19 and verse 40, that does say that Jesus was wrapped in what are called, in Greek, it's called athonion, which does mean linen cloths, and it can mean bandages. And sometimes in our English Bibles, it's translated as cloth strips. Um, but what's really interesting is that the reasoning behind translating that word as cloth strips is actually is kind of loose because it's sort of bouncing off of the story of Lazarus in John chapter 11. And even in that story, it's not exactly clear that Lazarus was wrapped like a mummy either. What it says is that his hands and his feet were tied, and
We're
that,
bound, yeah.
yeah, were bound, and that his face was covered. Um, but when you actually look at what the text says, there's no implication there that their individual appendages would have been wrapped in strips all over like an Egyptian mummy. That just wasn't really a Jewish custom. So what it probably actually means in terms of the hands and feet being tied is that there were strips of cloth being used to just tie the hands together, the wrists together, and to tie the feet together as well. But that was probably true of Lazarus. In terms of Jesus, it doesn't specifically say that his hands and feet were tied. So that detail is carried over from the story of Lazarus. What it says is that Jesus was wrapped in athonion, and that's as clear as it gets. Now, what's interesting is that in John chapter 19, that word is sometimes translated as strips, but the same word is used a few more times in John chapter 20. And in John chapter 20, most translations just translate it as linen cloths, implying that there were multiple cloths, multiple pieces of linen there. So that is actually too vague for us to determine exactly, first of all, how many cloths there were or what kinds of cloths they were. It just says that there were linen cloths. So this sometimes gets confused in Christians' mind, um, but I think that when you add in the details from the synoptic gospels, from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in those accounts of Jesus's burial, those do specifically say that Jesus was wrapped in a singular linen cloth referred to as a sindon. And this word sindon just means a cloth. And it is also the word where we get the term syndonology from, which is the study of the Shroud of Turin. So when you combine John's account with the synoptics, what you end up with is a picture of Jesus being buried in a in one singular cloth, probably wrapped with one or two strips to keep that cloth bound to the body somehow. And then, in addition, of course, there was the face cloth, which John refers to in Greek as the sudarion. Peter and John go into the tomb. They do see that the face cloth was folded in a place by itself. And John does mention that the sudarion had covered Jesus's face. But what he's not clear about in the account is whether or not the face cloth covered Jesus's face while he was inside the tomb. And obviously, this would be a contradiction for the Shroud of Turin, because the shroud is one cloth and the face obviously is on that one cloth. So if there was a cloth covering the face, then what do you do with this detail in Scripture that there was a separate face cloth? And honestly, that would be a very that would be a strong objection, if not for the existence, as you know, of a second artifact called the Sudarium of Oviedo, which is another piece of cloth that we have, that also has blood on it, and based on some experiments that have been done, it has the same blood type as the blood on the shroud, and it just so happens that the blood stains on the Sudarium, which doesn't have a miraculous image, but that the blood stains have a pattern to them that match the dimensions of the face on the shroud. And what this cloth probably was it was actually probably used to cover Jesus's face as he was being taken off of the cross. And it was probably used to soak up a lot of the blood that had been coming out of his nose. So the most prominent blood stains on the Sudarium are actually from a greatly significant nosebleed during the crucifixion. So it's very possible that the Sudarium had been around Jesus' face until they brought him into the tomb, and then wrapped him in the shroud. Now, where exactly was the Sudarium when the image on the shroud was formed? That's been debated. There's really no way for us to tell, because there's no image on, so far as we can tell, there's no image on the Sudarium. Some people have suggested that it was kind of folded up like a pillow, like maybe it was underneath his head, underneath the shroud, on the outside of the shroud, that is. Some people have suggested that maybe it was tied around the top of his head to keep his mouth closed, which there is a possibility. There's there is some room, some spatial room for that in the shroud image itself, because there's kind of this divide between the face and the hair. So it could be, and then, there wouldn't be a shroud. There wouldn't be an image on the Sudarium that way, if the image was projected vertically, that is. So all that to say that actually, when we look at the scriptural data and what those Greek words actually mean, we are not talking about something that would contradict the apparent reality of the shroud. And this is a pretty common objection from Christians, like I said, but I think there are really, really good answers to this question. You just kind of have to shake yourself loose of some of those preconceived visuals that you have in your mind, or all of those Jesus movies that you've seen throughout the years that have shown it in one way or another. I'm really counting on Mel Gibson for his new Resurrection of the Christ movie. He is a Shroud believer, and I am quite confident that he is going to get it right.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that too. Yeah.
That'd be amazing.
It's funny too. There's, when I think of the word clause, it could be, a couple of things. One is, like you said, there was the shroud, we believe was there. Then there was the face cloth, maybe off to the side. I think in the verbiage it says off to the side, and then of course there's the original Greek text that we have more or less back to, let's say, the 4th century, I think, with the Codex Sinaiticus. and and so it talks about that. But so you can't just use the translation; you've got to use the original, which that's where the word Othonia comes from. Now, the other thing though is that there's probably a couple of other cloths that were part of the burial. One was possibly there's the hypothesis that there was one holding the jaw shut while he was lying there, in the tomb. There's another one that in Bruges there's a cloth where they were tied where it tied the thumbs together
Hmm.
so that the hands don't flop over to the side while they're preparing the body. So that it may be that one is the one that's tying the thumbs and hands together. And that's why then you can't see the thumbs because they've been tied together, like I'm not,
Sure.
showing it. And then there's also a cloth strip on the shroud that has been sewn back on. It's about 3 or 4 inches wide, goes the full length, and it's not multiple pieces, it's one piece.
Yeah.
And so it could be that was somehow maybe that was the one that wrapped the body or whatever. And but there's no image on that piece. If it had wrapped the
No.
body in some fashion, it would have been outside of the shroud, the sindon, and
Yeah.
therefore it wouldn't have gotten any image. I don't know. Any thoughts on that? Or
Yeah, I was going to bring up that strip if you didn't, because it is obviously part of the original shroud. It's not a separate piece that was sewn onto the shroud. It's part of the shroud itself, and it was cut off at some point and sewn back on. So, because it's part of the standard measurement of the shroud, which is like 8 cubits by 2 cubits, something like that. Um, yeah, somebody did a recreation of this, and I would have to find the picture, but somebody did a recreation where they showed that if you take that strip while Jesus is folded up in the shroud, you could sort of loosely wrap it around the body just to keep the shroud itself secure. It would still be rather loose, but it would be secure. It wouldn't, it wouldn't fall off or it wouldn't slip off or anything like that. And the reason that this is important to remember, of course, as well, is that Jesus's burial was not finished. So so a lot of skeptics sometimes like to bring up Jewish burial customs, and well, here's the thing: they didn't get to finish with Jesus yet. The reason that the women came back to the tomb on Sunday was to finish the burial process. So it's really hard for us to say exactly how Jesus was wrapped up in incompletely if well they clearly intended to come back and finish everything after the Sabbath. So are they the ones who cut that strip off? That's very possible. Are they the ones who sewed it back on? I mean, I kind of doubt that they did it that day. It just depends on who got a hold of the shroud first after Jesus was found no longer in it.
right, right. Well, and I think there's probably even more in there that would be interesting and potentially help to understand how the body was buried, and whether and how the that one strip was wrapped around, and then what John and Peter saw as they ran up to the tomb, and Peter brashly just runs right into the tomb, and Peter and
Yeah,
John kind of stays outside.
yeah,
Um, but in any case, man, I would love to keep going, Duran. This is a fantastic discussion,
yeah.
and I know that there's a whole bunch of other potential objections, and we didn't even go through the radiocarbon dating, which is
No.
clearly one of the big ones that people hold out as against the authenticity. And unfortunately, or fortunately, that has been debunked pretty well. But we're not going to get a chance to talk about it today. Any last comments before we close?
I mean, there's so much more to say. I would just say, because I at this point in our discussion, for anybody listening, they're probably wondering, well, who did get a hold of the shroud? And this is something that I've spent a good deal of time sort of obsessing over. Obviously, we don't have any clear written record of who took the shroud out of the tomb, who took it to where after that. I mean, there are theories about how it got to Antioch or Edessa. There are some really, really interesting legends about the burial cloths of Jesus, and I can't imagine that those would exist unless there was an actual burial shroud kind of floating around somewhere. Unlike something like the Veil of Veronica, where that story doesn't even emerge until centuries and centuries later, these stories of the burial cloths of Jesus being passed around from person to person. There's one pretty incredible version where Pilate's wife goes to the tomb and she ends up taking it back to her hometown, which is kind of way north up in Turkey. There's also an implication that Luke, the good physician, ended up with it at some point. Maybe he took it up to Antioch because that's where he was from. And then there's also, of course, the possibility that the apostles themselves were using it for evangelism. I am actually very open to the suggestion that other people have suggested that Galatians chapter 3, verse 1 is possibly a veiled reference to the shroud from the Apostle Paul. He says to them, before your eyes, Christ was clearly portrayed as crucified among you. And I did kind of a long analysis of that passage myself using ChatGPT to go over the various objections and the various possibilities in the Greek. And in the end, I was able to kind of get ChatGPT to admit that this is very, very strange language, if he's only referring to a sermon or a letter or even a performance of some sort. That doesn't really line up with what Paul seems to be describing there. So, there are some possibilities here that get us to, because ultimately where we really want to get to is about the 6th or 7th century, to figure out, how it ended up north of Jerusalem up in Antioch or Edessa. But I mean, there are plausible answers to those questions. It could be that there's some historical record out there that we don't have yet. But I think you can form sort of a rough picture of probably what they were using the shroud for. And the other part of that too is that we know that later on in the later centuries that they were using the shroud in Eucharistic ceremonies in private, because there are actually stains and damage to the shroud from these ceremonies that they were doing with like candles and stuff. So it's very possible that, and we know that the early Christians too were used the Eucharistic ceremonies, the Lord's Supper, as sort of the initiation process. It was sort of the stamp of approval from the church that you are now a Christian and part of the church. So it's very possible that the shroud was being reserved for that private use, and it wasn't always just being thrown out in public like that, which is probably why they didn't want to talk too much about it.
Yeah.
But they probably considered it a privilege for someone to be able to actually see it with their own eyes.
Well, and you had the discipline of the secret, potentially, which may have led to the early apostles or the early holders of the material of the cloth to keep it secret and only maybe display it for a certain events. Let's cut it right there. Let's definitely do another one of these. This was fantastic, Duran. And where can folks reach you and find out more about you and some of your ministries?
So you can just head to my website, which is veramyth.com. Here I can share my screen real quick with you. Veramyth.com. That's VERIMYTH, which means true story. And there's a link here where you can support my work with Ratio Christi as well. There on my homepage, that will take you to my Ratio Christi giving page where you can contribute to my chapter work, ministering at Georgia Tech and just around Atlanta in general. So So yeah, if anybody
Fantastic.
wants to find out more about me, just head on to my website, and that's where you'll find all you need.
Fantastic. So veramyth.com. That's fantastic.
Right.
Duran, let's cut it right there. So for the audience, please stay tuned for many other videos in this series of the backstory on the Shroud of Turin. Today was especially interesting as we're trying to review some of the typical objections that Shroud authenticists get, and how then to talk intelligently about them to kind of argue against that. And Duran, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Great to have you today.
It's my pleasure. Great to talk to you as well, Guy.
Thank you.